Before we proceed in our series considering heresies against which the early church had to contend, I found it necessary to devote today's session to discuss and really give an overview of Plato's philosophy. Now, again, this is an overview, but hopefully, God willing anyway, today will give you enough information with which to impress your family and friends. However, so Plato and Aristotle are known as two of the great giants of philosophy. And historians have said that all philosophy subsequent to Plato and Aristotle are merely cliff notes to Plato and Aristotle. So today, again, I really want to give a brief overview about some of Plato's thoughts, where we can see these within the heresies, which we will discuss over the course of this series, and with the apologists who would have to contend against these heresies. So Plato was born in 427 BC. He was born to an aristocratic family, and Plato actually wasn't his real name. Plato was a name given to him by his coach. He was an athlete, he was into wrestling, and the name Plato really means broad-shouldered. However, he was, as we all know, he was a disciple of Socrates, and it was really at the age of 28 where Socrates was executed, where he was forced to drink the hemlock and so on. And during Socrates' lifetime, and then following Socrates' life, he would write dialogues from Socrates that Socrates would have with people in the agora, in the marketplace. Now, as you can see, I have a chair today within today's session, and this isn't for me to be lazy, so I can sit on here and teach you from the chair, although it does sound good to me right now because my legs are sore. However, I am not going to do so. This is actually an object lesson, and so I'm going to use the chair as a prop in order to illustrate some of Plato's thoughts. But Plato, before we get to that, I do want to introduce a few things first. Plato is famous for a few things, one of which was founding what he called the Academy. Now, the Academy was an olive grove, well, originally it was an olive grove given to him, donated to him by a man by the name of Academus, from which we get the name Academy and the title Academy. And sometimes this is why you will hear about the groves of academia. This is exactly where it comes from. The Academy was built on olive groves. Now, over the entrance into this academy was a sign which read, "Let none but geometers enter here." It's much like Dante's sign over the gates of Hades, which read, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." However, his sign to the academy said, "Let none but geometers enter here." Now, if we break that word down etymologically, geometry, geo means earth, okay? And then when you talk about metry or meter, you're talking about a form of measurement. So geometry in the ancient world really had to do with studying the forms of the earth. Now, some of which we did study in geometry, such as the triangle, the squares, rectangles, prisms, spheres, and so on. However, what Plato really thought was that the universe is forms. So in other words, truth is not material. Truth is formal. Now, Plato's also famous for giving his theory of ideas, also called his theory of forms. So in one way, we can say that Plato was an idealist. But in another way, we can say that he is and was a realist. Now, this seems like a contradiction, and it seems like I might be speaking out of both sides of my mouth. However, what we mean by these terms, idealist and realist, are different than how we typically think of them today. We think of an idealist as somebody who's somewhat Pollyannish. He's kind of a dreamer. He doesn't really face reality, where a realist is someone who basically shows his heroes warts and all. He's a realist. He's not drawn to this fantastic world and so on. But in the way we are considering idealist and realist is a little bit different, as I hope to show, beginning with my prop. Now again, I have this chair here, and I'm going to use my youngest son because we consider some pretty academic things from time to time, and so I don't want to embarrass anybody else with this profound question. So Judah, what is this? What do we have here? What is this? It's a chair. See, y'all wouldn't have been able to figure that out, okay? He is the only one in this entire group who can figure that out. Now, so you say it's a chair. How do you know it's a chair?
It's got 4 legs.
Has 4 legs. Well, there you go. That's a chair because it has 4 legs. However, horses have 4 legs, Judah, and you don't call that a chair. So why do you call this a chair?
It's got armrests.
It's called armrests, okay. Couches have armrests, sofas have armrests, other things have armrests. Why do you call this a chair and not a sofa?
I don't know.
Okay. Now, I mean, we can keep on doing this ad nauseum, and this is the Socratic method, ultimately, just penetrating with questions to get to the truth of the matter. Now, what's interesting about what Plato is giving here is the fact that we can see so many different kinds of chairs. You have wooden chairs, you have upholstered chairs, you have simple chairs, you have folding chairs, you have all kinds of different chairs. And somehow, when we experience a chair, we come to see a chair, we can automatically, through the categories of our minds, deduce and conclude that this is a chair. And so, likewise, we can do this in all of reality. We look outside, we go outside, and we see all sorts of different trees. You have all sorts of different trees. And yet, we can identify that as a tree as a tree. We see all sorts of different people. We see dark people, we see light people, we see thin people, we see heavy people. We see all sorts of different kinds of people, and yet we can all, again, deduce and conclude when we see a person that is a person. And Plato would basically scratch his head and wonder, how is that? How is it possible that through all of the diversity of these particular things or beings that we can extrapolate, that we can conclude, that we can deduce out of all this diversity, this specific one, as this object as what it is? Well, for Plato, he thought that the idea of chair is true and a reality. And ultimately, in other words, simply put, there is such a thing as chairness. There is a perfect form or idea of chair that truly exists in the super temporal world, we'll say, the spiritual realm out there above and beyond us. But there is a reality. There is such a thing as chairness. There's such a thing as humanness. Okay, so there is this idea and this perfect form of humanity from which we can derive a human as a human. So he would say that these ideas of chairness, of humanness, of treeness, and so on are real. And that's basically how we can say that he's both an idealist and a realist. So now, with this, he's basically saying that these realities exist apart from us, but they have ontological being. Okay, so this idea of chairness, this idea of humanness, has ontological status. Okay, so in the realm of philosophy, ontology is one of the greatest sciences within philosophy. Another is epistemology. How do we know what we know? So basically, he's saying that the beings, the ontological status of these things are real. But how do we know that? How do we know that that very thing? Now, what he would say is that these objects that we encounter every day, like a chair, is what he called a receptacle. So all of these receptacles, ourselves included, are physical receptacles. In other words, they're imperfect copies of that perfect being of humanness or of chairness. It is an imperfect copy. So he would say, and he believed, that humanity is made up of body and soul, just as Christians do. However, he said that the soul is eternal. The soul has always existed, and it is from that eternal, perfect world. And so he's also known for his theory of recollection, which we'll get to here in a second. But with this idea of these receptacles, again, these are imperfect copies of the perfect and the true reality of chairness. Okay, so this is basically where, now what he would say regarding this is that they are metaphysical imperfections. Okay, that's really what he's talking about. They're philosophical and ontologically imperfect as compared to that perfect reality of chairness, humanness, treeness, and so on. And all the nisses, all the true ontological beings that exist in the supertemporal or supernatural realm. Now, it's not a far leap from that, though, from going to metaphysical imperfection to moral imperfection, and we see this within the church, beginning with the monastic age and many other things besides, where everything that is physical is imperfect and therefore not good, because obviously these ontological beings that exist are pure good. They are pure goodness as well. And so with these imperfect receptacles, then obviously if they are not good, if they are not inherently good, then they are imperfect. And it's not a far step from there to they are evil. And so we see people giving up things such as food, drink, sex, and so on, because these physical things are evil. However, things such as sex would be referred to as a necessary evil for the propagation of the species. A husband and a wife must come together and become one flesh and procreate. He came across the Pythagoreans, very much taught him the doctrine of transmigration, the transmigration of the soul. Now, that's a fancy word, but we can understand what transmigration is. We've all heard of trans. The prefix trans means across. Ultimately, think of transatlantic, think of transportation. But then migration, we know what emigration is. We know immigration. We know about migratory birds. Migratory birds are birds that migrate from one place to another. So transmigration is basically a moving of the soul from one place to another. We all know this as another word, which is reincarnation, very much well known and popular among Eastern philosophy and Eastern religions. So he believed in this reincarnation where, obviously in the Eastern religions, we are born with this particular body for this particular life, and depending on how we live in this life will determine whether or not we are reincarnated as a toad or as a king or something of that sort. So this theory of recollection, though, so again, ultimately the soul is eternal, but every time it's embodied, every time the body captures the soul and encases the soul and contains the soul, then what happens because of the body, because it is an imperfect receptacle, the body basically dulls the intelligence, the knowledge that the soul always had. So this theory of recollection is basically his theory that we are born with certain innate ideas, and these are real and they exist, but the process of education is not really filling us with knowledge. It's really trying to extrapolate and to get out of us the knowledge that we already have, that we have had for all of eternity, save for these silly little bodies that continue to dull this knowledge and so on. And so his most famous illustration of this theory of recollection is what's called Plato's cave. I'm sure we've all heard of Plato's cave. An abbreviated form of this, just as an overview and as a review, Plato's cave is basically this, where men are from their infancy, they're born in a prison and they're chained to a wall behind them, ultimately. And behind them is this partition. And above and behind this partition comes light into the cave. But they can't see the light directly. All they can see is the wall across them and the light that is peeking in from behind this partition. And so all of these prisoners can only see the shadows on the wall. They can't see each other. So basically what Plato is saying is that these shadows aren't real. They're real shadows, but they're not the real people. They're not the real beings. They're not the ontological beings of the real person, ultimately, the real human. All they're seeing are the shadows dancing on the wall, but they are not the real thing in and of itself. And so what Plato would basically say would be that we must unshackle ourselves and free ourselves from this cave. Now, we must understand this is merely an illustration, okay? Because he doesn't believe that if you were to literally unshackle yourself and free yourself from this cave, then out of the cave you will see all of the ontological realities of chairness and hupenness and so on. You would still see the receptacles, but this is an earthly analogy from which he's trying to show his theory of recollection. Ultimately, once we can free ourselves from these shackles, then at least we can see each other more than merely shadows. That's what he's basically saying. So for his epistemology, truth comes through the mind, not really through experience. And so we'll be using these terms, so it's important, so we must at least introduce them here. In philosophy, we make a distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge means knowledge that we have prior to experience. Now, let me ask you this, because he's saying that basically all knowledge is a priori, ultimately, and all we need to do is unshackle ourselves and free ourselves from this body, that which is physical, to attain the truth of the real. Okay, the ideal real or the real ideal. See, these things they go together. So a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. I ask you, in Christianity, do we believe in any form of a priori knowledge? Knowledge that we have with which we're born? Well, yes, Paul says that basically everybody has a sense of God. There is knowledge with which we are born. In particular, in Christianity, we say this is a knowledge of God. Now, again, though, with this a priori knowledge, what he's saying is what he wanted to do, what the job of the scientist and the philosopher is to save the phenomena. Now, what is the phenomena? The phenomena are the physical data bits. They're the real data bits. They're the things like a chair, okay, that we see, that we perceive a posteriori, from which we deduce. Because of this is a priori, all of this is a priori, but we deduce from these phenomena. However, so what he's ultimately saying, in order to perceive these phenomena, in order to save the phenomena, we must move past and beyond the physical, the very phenomena themselves, in order to study and to understand that phenomena. Okay, so such is Plato's, in a brief way, his philosophy. Okay, now what he also is famous for is basically saying that all things, all of this reality basically comes from one who is good. And this good one is the author of all truth, of all beauty, all of what we would call holy. And there's been a debate ever since then about whether this is Plato's God. He never says he is. However, it's because of this that someone like a Justin Martyr would read Plato's writings and see within that this one is the very Yahweh. This one is the Godhead of the Old Testament and of the New Testament. And so many of these heresies, which we will consider, come out of this agnosticism, really from this, I don't want to, because it's not really hatred, but it's a disregard of that which is physical. That's going to be important as we continue on. However, much of what he says about this one good being, later apologists such as Justin Martyr would use to contend for the faith that was delivered once and for all, as Jude tells us. And so ultimately that's what we're after, the faith once delivered, or delivered once for all. And we can use Plato as the apologists did, but we will see many of the heresies also used Plato in order to denounce the physical, because in our world we also have this tendency, even within the church, we have this tendency to see that which is physical as somewhat inherently evil, not perfect, not good. Now, where do we get that idea? We definitely don't get it from creation. We don't get it from the Bible, where God created all things and he said it is good. Everything that he made, save for man's loneliness, is good and was good. So we don't get that from the Bible. We get that from Plato. Plato has influenced much of our contemporary thinking. And it's interesting how long this philosophy and this worldview has continued and manifested in different ways and at different times. And so I wanted today to be basically a springboard off which we can continue considering, well, I guess really begin to see, to consider these heresies, and again, also to see the framework of the argumentation against these heresies.